The abandoned lady at the trading post gasped when she saw her family's medallion hanging from the neck of the trapper's son. Elijah's heart plummeted as he recognized her eyes, the same haunting gray that had stared back at him every day from the face of the boy he had stolen and raised as his own. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Winter had sunk its teeth deep into the Rockies, painting the jagged peaks white and turning the air brittle enough to snap. Elijah Blackwood hardly noticed anymore. 23 years in these mountains had made him as much a part of the landscape as the pines and granite. His weathered face, framed by a salt and pepper beard and hidden beneath a worn fur cap, had seen more winters than most men survived out here. The lone trapper guided his pack mule down the narrow trail toward Fort Willow, the closest thing to civilization for 100 miles. Twice yearly he made this journey, once in late autumn to sell his summer pelts and once in spring to replenish supplies before retreating back into the wilderness. This particular journey carried more weight than usual. The boy was turning 18 soon. Not his boy, Elijah reminded himself. Never truly his. But after raising him from a squalling infant to a man on the cusp of his own life, blood seemed a trivial distinction. The fort appeared through the trees as the trail widened, smoke from a dozen chimneys rising against the steel-gray sky. Fort Willow wasn't much. A trading post, a few cabins, a smithy, and what passed for a tavern, but after months alone in the high country with only Thomas for company, it might as well have been St. Louis. Thomas rode slightly ahead, his back straight with excitement. Elijah smiled beneath his beard. The boy had his mother's bearing, though he'd never tell him that. "Steady," Elijah called as Thomas urged his horse forward. "Fort's been there 20 years. It'll wait another 5 minutes." Thomas turned in his saddle, grinning. His face was smooth compared to Elijah's weathered one, but his eyes held the same watchfulness, the same careful assessment of everything around him. "I can smell fresh bread," Thomas called back. "And coffee," Elijah nodded. "Soap, if you've a mind to remember what that is." The fort's gates stood open as they approached. A couple of men loading a wagon nodded in greeting, recognizing the old trapper even after 6 months' absence. Elijah acknowledged them with a slight tip of his head, then guided his animals toward the trading post. Fort Willow seemed busier than usual. A stagecoach rare this time of year sat outside the tavern, its team unhitched and stabled. New faces moved about, and Elijah felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck that came with too many people in one place. "I'll see to the pelts," Thomas said, already dismounting. "You check if there's mail." Elijah grunted his agreement, swinging stiffly from his saddle. Every year the dismount seemed harder, though he'd die before admitting it. He secured his horse and made his way toward the trading post, boots crunching on the hard-packed snow. The warmth inside the post hit him like a physical force. Jebediah Miller, the trader who'd run the place as long as Elijah could remember, looked up from behind his counter and broke into a yellow-toothed smile. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of the mountains himself," Miller called. "Thought maybe the wolves finally got you this winter." "Wolves know better," Elijah replied, unwinding the woolen scarf from his neck. "Any letters come for us?" Miller's smile faltered slightly. "Nothing this time, Dot." Stingle quotes he busied himself with something under the counter. But you got good timing. Stage brought in some interesting folks yesterday." Elijah wasn't interested in Traveler's Tale. "Thomas will be bringing in the pelts. Mostly beaver, some marten, few wolf." Good, Miller nodded. "Prices are strong this season. Eastern dandies can't get enough of their beaver hats." A commotion outside drew Elijah's attention. Raised voices, then the sound of something falling. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt as he turned toward the door. "Just some disagreement with the stage passengers," Miller explained quickly. "Been tense since they arrived. Lady traveling alone causing quite a stir." Elijah grunted, uninterested in fort drama. He began listing the supplies they needed, but the door to the trading post swung open, bringing with it a gust of cold air and something else entirely, the scent of lavender. She stood framed in the doorway, and for a moment Elijah thought his mind was playing tricks. Women were scarce enough at Fort Willow, but women like her simply didn't exist in these parts. Her dress, though travel-worn, was clearly expensive, its muted blue fabric a shock of refinement against the rough-hewn logs. Her hair was swept up beneath a small hat, revealing a face that belonged in a painted portrait, not a frontier trading post. But it was her eyes that stopped Elijah, cold gray as a winter sky, sharp as flint, and hauntingly familiar. The woman surveyed the trading post, her gaze finally settling on Elijah. For a moment something like recognition flickered across her face, quickly replaced by the careful mask of polite society. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, her voice cultured with the rounded vowels of a proper Eastern education. "I was told I might find the proprietor here." Miller stepped forward, wiping his hands on his apron. "That'd be me, ma'am, Jebediah Miller. How can I help you?" The woman's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. "I find myself in an unfortunate situation. The stagecoach is continuing west tomorrow, but I must remain here. I require lodging, but I'm told the accommodations are ... limited." Miller shot a nervous glance at Elijah. "Well, ma'am, we don't exactly have a hotel. The tavern has rooms, but they're unsuitable for a lady traveling alone." "Yes, I've been informed." Her composed expression expression didn't waver, but Elijah caught the slight tightening of her gloved hands on her retic. I was hoping you might know of an alternative. Before Miller could respond, the door opened again, and Thomas backed in, arms laden with furs. First load, Elijah. There's plenty more. He turned and stopped mid-sentence, his eyes landing on the woman. For a frozen moment, nobody spoke. Elijah watched as the woman's carefully maintained composure cracked. Her face went pale, her lips parting in shock as she stared at Thomas. One gloved hand rose to her throat where a locket hung. I'm sorry. Thomas recovered first, nodding politely. Didn't mean to interrupt, but the woman wasn't listening. She was staring at Thomas with an intensity that made Elijah's spine stiffen. He stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between them. Thomas, he said gruffly, finish bringing in the pelts dots. Single quotes. Thomas glanced between Elijah and the woman, clearly confused, but nodded and retreated outside. The woman's eyes followed him until the door closed, then snapped to Elijah with a new sharpness. That young man, she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. Is he your son? Something cold and heavy settled in Elijah's stomach, and the question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications he'd spent 18 years avoiding. Who's asking? He replied, his voice rough as tree bark. She met his gaze unflinchingly. My name is Catherine Thornhill, and I believe ... Single quotes. Her voice wavered for the first time. I believe I've been searching for him for a very long time. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the trading post's walls. Snow began to fall, thick flakes swirling past the window. A storm was coming, and not just the kind that brought snow. Elijah felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the past he'd fled for so long suddenly rushing toward him like an avalanche. The woman Catherine stood before him, a ghost made flesh, her gray eyes so like Thomas's that it stole his breath. We should talk, he finally said, each word dragged from somewhere deep and painful, but not here. For the first time since she entered, Catherine's expression softened, relief and fear mingling on her face. She nodded once, a simple gesture that sealed all their fates. Yes, she agreed softly. I believe we have much to discuss, Mr. Blackwood, he supplied. Elijah Blackwood. Recognition dawned in her eyes, confirmation of something she already suspected. Elijah Blackwood, she repeated, testing the name. The man who disappeared from Missouri 18 years ago. With my infant son. Catherine Thornhill had not traveled 2,000 miles to lose her composure in a dusty trading post. Yet seeing the young man, her son, she was certain of it, had nearly undone her. She stood rigid as Elijah Blackwood murmured something to Miller about using his back office for a private conversation. The trader nodded, casting curious glances between them before ushering them through a door behind the counter. The small room was cluttered with ledgers and crates smelling of tobacco and ink. A single window let in weak winter light. Elijah closed the door and remained standing, his broad shoulders blocking the exit. In the confined space, Catherine could smell the wilderness on him, pine sap, wood smoke, and something untamed. This was the man who had stolen her child, yet she felt no fear. Only a desperate need for answers. How did you find us? His voice was low, rough from disuse. Catherine removed her gloves deliberately, buying time to steady herself. I didn't, not specifically. I've been searching for years. Following rumors, hiring investigators when I could afford them. The trail led west, always west. She looked up at him. Until last month when a fur buyer in St. Louis mentioned a trapper named Blackwood who appeared years ago with It was the first solid lead I'd had. Elijah's weathered face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped his belt. You had no right, Catherine said quietly, anger simmering beneath her controlled exterior. He was my son, was he? Elijah's question cut like a knife. Seemed to me he belonged to nobody the night I found him. Catherine flinched. You know nothing about that night. I know enough. His eyes, hard as river stones, fixed on her. I know your husband was a drunk who gambled away everything you had. I know he died owing money to dangerous men, and I know he tried to settle those debts with his own son. The blood drained from Catherine's face. That's a lie. Elijah shook his head slowly. I was there, ma'am, working as hired security at Harrison's riverboat. Saw your husband lose everything, then offer something else, a baby boy, his heir. To a man who collected children for purposes I won't speak of. His voice roughened further. When your husband sobered enough to regret his bargain and tried to back out, they beat him senseless and tossed him overboard. Catherine swayed, reaching for the edge of the desk to steady herself. Memories flooded back, George stumbling home drunk, promising their financial troubles were over, then disappearing for days. The men who came later searching their home, claiming George had stolen something valuable. They said he took money, she whispered. He took the child, Elijah corrected, after he'd already sold him. Harrison's men were coming for the boy that night. He paused. I got there first. Catherine sank onto a crate, her legs no longer able to support her. You broke into my home. I did. No apology colored his voice. Found you unconscious laudanum, I figured. Dan the baby crying in his cradle. Harrison's men were less than an hour behind me. So you took him. The accusation hung in the air. Elijah's expression hardened. Would you rather I'd left him? Left you both to whatever Harrison had planned. You could have woken me. Catherine's composure finally cracked. You could have warned me. And you'd have done what? Exactly, Elijah asked, his voice dangerously quiet. A widowed woman with no family, no money, and men coming to collect a debt? Say, where would you have gone? The truth of his words struck her like physical blows. She'd asked herself the same questions 1,000 times over the years. What would she have done? Where would she have gone? I would have found a way, she said finally. Mothers always do. Something flickered across Elijah's face. Maybe so, but I couldn't take that chance. An uncomfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the muffled sounds of the trading post beyond the door. Why didn't you leave a note? Catherine finally asked, her voice smaller than she intended. All these years, not knowing if he was alive or dead, ... Single quotes. Elijah turned toward the window, his profile harsh in the gray light. I meant to send word once we were safe, but Harrison's men were thorough. They tracked us halfway across Missouri. His shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. By the time I was sure we'd lost them, months had passed. The boy had taken sick on the journey, nearly died twice. He turned back to face her. By then, news had spread that the Thornhill widow had lost her mind with grief, that she'd been committed to an asylum. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. My sister's doing. She thought it would be easier than explaining I was searching for my stolen child. A bitter smile touched her lips. She was always practical, Caroline. She arranged everything, the story of my breakdown, the private sanatorium upstate, even the modest income that kept me comfortable but controlled. How long? Elijah asked. 3 years. Her eyes opened, steel in her gaze, until the doctor realized I wasn't insane, just desperate. He helped me leave, get established under my maiden. Elijah nodded slowly. And you've been looking ever since? 15 years. Catherine straightened her shoulder. Teaching music to support myself, saving every penny, following every whisper of a man with a child who didn't belong to him. Outside, they heard Thomas's voice as he continued bringing in their furs. Catherine's breath caught at the sound. Does he know? She asked. About me? About how you came to have him? Elijah's face closed like a shutter. He knows he's not my blood. Knows I found him as a baby and his parents were dead. Nothing more. So he believes he's an orphan. Catherine's voice was barely audible. Better than believing he was sold by his father and abandoned by his mother. The words were harsh, but Elijah's tone wasn't cruel, merely matter-of-fact. Catherine rose, her hands trembling with suppressed emotion. I never abandoned him. I've spent my entire adult life searching for him. And now you found him, Elijah said flatly. What exactly do you plan to do, Mrs. Thornhill? The question hung between them, laden with implications. Catherine had imagined this moment countless times over the years, but the reality was more complicated than her dreams. The boy she sought, the infant she'd lost, was now a young man, nearly grown, with no memory of her, a young man who called this gruff mountain trapper father. Before she could answer, the office door swung open. Thomas stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. His curious gaze swept from Catherine to Elijah and back again. Everything all right? He asked. Miller said you needed a moment, but the storm's picking up. We should get our supplies and find shelter before it gets worse. Standing beside him, Catherine could now see what the shock of their first encounter had obscured. He had her gray eyes, yes, but his father's strong jawline and broad shoulders. Georgia's dimple appeared in his right cheek when he spoke. The sight made her heart ache with recognition. Elijah cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornhill needs accommodation. The tavern's not suitable. Thomas nodded, his natural courtesy emerged. The widow Carson sometimes takes in travelers. Her cabin's small but clean. Catherine couldn't tear her eyes from his face. It's very kind of you. An awkward silence fell. Thomas glanced between them again, clearly sensing the tension. Do you two know each other? No, Elijah said quickly. Yes, Catherine said simultaneously. Thomas raised his eyebrows, waiting for clarification. Catherine gathered her courage. 18 years of searching had led to this moment. Your father and I are ... acquainted from long ago. From Missouri. The young man's expression brightened with interest. Missouri? Elijah never talks about the time before we came west. For good reason, Elijah muttered, shooting Catherine a warning look. She ignored it. Perhaps we could speak more over dinner? I'd be glad to share what I know of ... those days. Thomas smiled, and Catherine's heart nearly stopped at the familiar expression. I'd like that, wouldn't we, Elijah? The trapper's face was unreadable, but Catherine recognized the calculation behind his eyes, weighing options, considering consequences, planning his next move. She'd seen the same expression on George's face 100 times. Storm's coming, he said finally. We'll need to stay in town at least tonight. I suppose dinner would pass the time. Catherine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't acceptance, but it was an opening. After 18 years of searching, she could wait a few more hours. Then it's settled, she said, replacing her gloves with steady hands. Tonight we'll begin to get acquainted. Thomas smiled again, oblivious to the currents swirling beneath the simple invitation. I'll see to our lodging at MR's Carson's. Perhaps you could join us there at 6. Catherine nodded, her composure fully restored. 6 o'clock would be perfect. As Thomas left to make arrangements, Elijah stepped close to Catherine, his voice low enough that only she could hear. One wrong word, he warned, one hint of your intentions before I've had a chance to explain things to him my way, and we'll be gone by morning. These mountains have 100 places where no one could find us again. Catherine met his gaze without flinching. He's my son. He's been my son for 18 years, Elijah countered, and I'll do what needs doing to protect him even from you. With that, he followed Thomas into the trading post, leaving Catherine alone with the weight of her discovery and the uncertain path ahead. Mrs. Carson's cabin sat at the eastern edge of Fort Willow, its windows glowing with lamplight against the gathering darkness. The widow had been delighted to earn extra income from unexpected guests, bustling about her modest home with more energy than her gray hair and stooped shoulders suggested possible. Catherine stood before the small looking glass in the guest room, adjusting her appearance as best she could. Her traveling clothes were hardly suitable for the occasion, but she'd managed to freshen her face and rearrange her hair. From her trunk she'd retrieved the one good dress she'd brought, a simple blue gown with lace at the collar. Around her neck hung the locket, inside which she'd kept a tiny wisp of dark hair cut from her infant son's head before he was taken. "You've come this far," she told her reflection. "Don't falter now." In the cabin's main room, Thomas helped Mrs. Carson set the table while Elijah stood by the hearth, his discomfort evident in his rigid posture. Unlike Thomas, who had made some effort to clean up, Elijah wore the same buckskins, though he had removed his fur cap and combed his fingers through his graying hair. When Catherine emerged from the bedroom, Thomas looked up and smiled. Something in his expression, warm, uncomplicated, brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. "Mrs. Thornhill," he greeted her, pulling out a chair. "You look rested." "Thank you," she replied, taking the offered seat. "And please call me Catherine." Mrs. Carson brought steaming bowls of rabbit stew to the table, along with a loaf of bread that looked heaven-sent after weeks of travel rations. The widow, sensing the strange tension in the room, announced she would eat in the kitchen, giving them privacy. For several minutes they ate in silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the food or the worsening storm outside. Catherine studied Thomas when she thought he wouldn't notice, the way he held his spoon, his careful manners so at odds with frontier life, the small gestures that echoed his father's. "Have you lived in these mountains long?" she finally asked, directing her question to Thomas. He nodded, swallowing a bite of bread. "Long as I can remember. We've had our cabin up near Bear Creek for about 12 years now. Before that, we moved around more." He glanced at Elijah. "Isn't that right?" Elijah grunted affirmation, his eyes never leaving Catherine. Said, "What do you remember of Missouri?" She pressed gently. Thomas shrugged. "Not much. I was just a baby when we left. Sometimes I think I remember a big river and the sound of paddle wheels. But Elijah says that's just from the stories he's told me." "You must have been very young indeed," Catherine murmured, her fingers unconsciously touching her locket. Thomas noticed the gesture. "That's pretty," he said, nodding toward the jewelry. "Is it a memento?" Catherine's hands stilled. "Yes. Something very precious was taken from me long ago. This is all I had left." Elijah set down his spoon with more force than necessary. "You mentioned teaching music, Mrs. Thornhill. Is that what brings you west, a teaching position?" She recognized the diversion but allowed it. "Not specifically. I've been searching for something, following a trail that has finally led me here." "What sort of trail?" Thomas asked, intrigued. Before Catherine could respond, Elijah cut in. "How long do you plan to stay at Fort Willow?" "Not much call for music teacher parts." "That depends," Catherine replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "On what I find here. On whether what I've been seeking can be ... recovered." The tension between them crackled like the fire in the hearth. Thomas looked between, the confusion evident on his face. "You two seem to have a lot of history for people who barely know each other." Catherine smiled sadly. "Sometimes a brief acquaintance can change the course of one's entire life." Elijah pushed back from the table. "Thomas, why don't you help Mrs. Carson with the washing up? I need a private word with Mrs. Thornhill." Thomas hesitated, clearly reluctant to be dismissed from what promised to be an interesting conversation. But years of obedience to the man who had raised him won out, and he nodded, gathering plates as he rose. When they were alone, Elijah leaned across the table, his voice low but intense. "What game are you playing? You promised to wait." "I promised not to reveal everything at once," Catherine corrected him. "But I won't pretend to be a stranger to my own son. Surely after 18 years you owe me at least some connection with him." "I owe you nothing," Elijah hissed. "I saved his life. I raised him. I taught him everything he knows. And I thank you for that," Catherine said, surprising him with her sincerity. "Truly, but it doesn't change the fact that he's my flesh and blood. I have a right to know him." "Rights?" Elijah's laugh was bitter. "Where were your rights when your husband was gambling away your son's future, when he was bargaining with the boy's life?" Catherine's composure slipped. "I didn't know," she whispered fiercely. "Do you think I would have allowed it if I'd known? George told me he was taking Thomas to visit his sister. I had taken laudanum for a migraine. I slept through their departure." Her hands trembled on the tablecloth. "When I woke, you had both vanished and men were ransacking my home. They thought I was hiding something valuable." "You were," Elijah said flatly. "The boy." Before Catherine could respond, Thomas returned, carrying a pot of coffee and cups. Mrs. Carson followed with a small cake on a plate. "A little something sweet," the widow announced, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Don't get many chances to bake for company out here, dots." Single quotes. Thomas poured coffee for everyone, then settled back in his chair. "So, Catherine, how did you know Elijah back in Missouri? Were you friends?" Elijah and Catherine exchanged glances. "Not exactly," Catherine said carefully. "We met under ... unusual circumstances. I worked security on the riverboats," Elijah explained, seizing control of the narrative. Mrs. Thornhill's husband was a regular at the tables, Thomas's expression dark. "You knew my father? My real father?" The question hung in the air, loaded with significance for all three of them. Catherine set down her coffee cup to hide her trembling hands. "I knew your father, yes." George Thornhill was ... single quotes. She hesitated, unwilling to tarnish the man's memory despite everything. "He was troubled. Gambling consumed him. He got himself killed over debts, Elijah added bluntly. Left his wife with nothing. Thomas absorbed this information, his brow furrowed. And my mother? Did you know her too? The directness of the question caught Catherine off guard. She opened her mouth, but no words came. She died not long after, Elijah said, his eyes warning Catherine to silence. Grief, they said. Catherine's hand clenched around her locket so tightly that her knuckles whitened. The lie cut deeper than she'd expected, but she held her tongue, remembering Elijah's threat to disappear with Thomas if she revealed too much too quickly. I'm sorry, Thomas said, his eyes soft with genuine sympathy. It must have been difficult for you, knowing them both. The irony of her son comforting her over her supposed death nearly undid Catherine's composure. Yes, she managed. It was devastating. Mrs. Carson, sensing the heavy atmosphere, rose to clear the dessert plates. Storm's really coming down now, she observed, peering out the window. You'll all have to stay put till morning, I expect. As if confirming her words, the wind howled around the cabin's eaves, rattling the shutters. Thomas stood to help the widow, leaving Elijah and Catherine alone again. This time it was Catherine who leaned forward. I won't tell him tonight, she whispered urgently, but I won't keep up this charade forever. He deserves the truth. And what truth is that? Elijah challenged. That his father was a scoundrel who sold him, that his mother couldn't protect him, or that a stranger stole him away in the night, that he was loved, Catherine replied, her voice breaking, that he was never forgotten, that his mother spent 18 years searching for him. Elijah's hard expression softened fractionally. He's had a good life. I've made sure of it. He can read and write better than most men out here. He knows the mountains, knows how to survive. He's strong, honorable. I can see that, Catherine acknowledged. I'm grateful, but it doesn't change what I am to him. And what about what I'm to him? Elijah countered, real pain finally breaking through his stoic facade. I'm the only father he remembers, the only constant he's ever had. For the first time, Catherine saw beyond the gruff exterior to the man beneath, a man who had raised another's child as his own, who had sacrificed a more comfortable life to keep that child safe, a man who now faced losing the one person who gave his life meaning. I'm not here to take him from you, she said softly. I only want a chance to know him, to be known by him. Elijah studied her face, searching for deception. And when he learns the truth? When he asks why I lied all these years? We'll face that together, Catherine suggested, as two people who care for him. Before Elijah could respond, Thomas returned, carrying more firewood for the hearth. As he stacked the logs, Catherine noticed a small medallion hanging from a leather cord around his neck, a tarnished silver disc that caught the firelight. Her breath caught. That medallion. Thomas glanced down, touching it self-consciously. Oh, this old thing? Elijah says I was wearing it when he found me. Only thing I had from before. He held it up for her to see. It's got some kind of bird design, see? And there's writing on the back, but it's too worn. Catherine's eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. The medallion had been a gift from her father to George, passed down through generations of Thornhill men. May I? She asked, her voice barely audible. Thomas hesitated, then slipped the cord over his head and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. Catherine had to stifle a sob at the first touch of her son's hand in 18 years. Elijah watched, his expression unreadable. As Catherine cradled the medallion, undeniable proof that the young man before them was indeed her lost child. Catherine held the medallion with reverent fingers, turning it over to examine the worn inscription on the back. Though the letters had faded with time and wear, she knew what they said. To each Thornhill son, honor and courage. Her father had spoken those words when he presented it to George on their wedding day. It's very old, she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. A family heirloom, I'd imagine. Thomas nodded, watching her curiously. So I've always wondered about the family it came from. My family, he glanced at Elijah. Not that I'm not grateful for the one I got. Elijah's expression remained guarded, but he nodded acknowledgement. Catherine reluctantly returned the medallion, fighting the urge to press it to her lips. Thank you for showing me. Single quotes. Thomas slipped it back over his head, tucking it beneath his shirt. Elijah says my mother put it on me to keep me safe. His gray eyes, so like her own, searched her face. Did you know her well enough to know if that's true? Before Catherine could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, Mrs. Carson bustled back into the room. Lord have mercy, the snow's coming down like Judgment Day out there. Sheriff Holt just stopped by to say the North Pass is already blocked. The widow shook her head. It's like nobody's going anywhere for at least a couple of days. Elijah frowned. We need to get back to our cabin. The trap lines will have to wait, Mrs. Carson said firmly. Unless you're keen on freezing to death halfway up the mountain. Sheriff says 3 feet of snow already and more coming. Thomas moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to peer into the swirling whiteness beyond. She's right, Elijah. Can't even see the trading post from here anymore. Catherine felt a rush of gratitude toward the storm that had conspired to give her more time with her son. It seems we're all to be Mrs. Carson's guests a while longer. The widow nodded. Got plenty of room. Mr. Blackwood and Thomas can take the back room, and you can keep the guest room, Mrs. Thornhill. As Mrs. Carson showed Elijah and Thomas to their quarters, Catherine retired to her own room, overwhelmed by the day's events. She sat on the edge of the bed, finally allowing herself a moment of unguarded emotion. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she opened her locket to compare the tiny lock of baby hair with the young man she'd just met. A soft knock at her door startled her. She quickly wiped her eyes and composed herself. Yes, it's Thomas. May I speak with you a moment? Catherine's heart leaped. Of course. She tucked the locket away and smoothed her dress before opening the door. Thomas stood in the hallway, a slightly awkward expression on his face. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I had some questions, if you don't mind. Not at all. She stepped aside to let him enter, leaving the door ajar for propriety's sake. Please. He hesitated at the threshold, then came in, looking around the modest room with interest. I've never really talked with anyone who knew my parents before. Elijah doesn't say much about those days. Catherine gestured for him to sit in the room's single chair while she perched on the edge of the bed. What would you like to know? Anything, really. His expression was eager, hungry for information about his origins. What were they like? Where did they live? Do I have any other family? Each question pierced Catherine's heart. She wanted desperately to tell him everything, but Elijah's warning echoed in her mind. Your father was handsome, she began carefully. Charming when he wanted to be. You have his dimple. She smiled faintly, indicating her own cheek. Thomas touched his face unconsciously. And my mother? Catherine swallowed hard. She was ... devoted to you. You were everything to her. That much at least was undeniable truth. Elijah says she died of grief after my father was killed. Thomas's gaze was direct, searching. Is that true? Catherine looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes while perpetuating the lie. Your mother suffered greatly after losing both her husband and her child. It wasn't exactly a confirmation, but Thomas seemed to accept it. Did she have family? People who would have taken me in if Elijah hadn't. A sister, Catherine said softly, but they weren't close. Your mother's family had disowned her when she married your father. They thought he was beneath her dots. Single quotes. Thomas absorbed this information thoughtfully. Were they right? The question startled her with its directness. After a moment's reflection, she answered honestly. In some ways, perhaps. But she loved him despite his flaws. Sometimes we can't help who we love even when they bring us pain. Like my father's gambling, Thomas nodded, making connections. That's why Elijah never allows cards or dice in our cabin. He always said they were tools of the devil. He wasn't wrong in your father's case, Catherine admitted. George could never resist a game, especially when the stakes were high. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mrs. Thornhill, Catherine, may I ask something personal? Of course. How did you come to be here at this remote trading post? It seems an unlikely destination for a music teacher from the East. Catherine tensed. This was dangerous territory. I've been ... traveling for some time, following a quest of sorts. What kind of quest? A search for something precious that was lost to me ago. She touched her locket again, the gesture becoming a tell she couldn't seem to control. Thomas's eyes followed the movement. Your locket? Does it have something to do with what you're searching for? Catherine nodded slowly. It contains my most cherished possession, a memory of what I lost. May I see it? Thomas asked, his curiosity evident. Panic fluttered in her chest. If he saw the lock of hair and side hair that matched his own as a child, he might begin to suspect the truth. Perhaps another time, she demurred. It's difficult for me to share. He accepted the refusal graciously. I understand. I didn't mean to pry. You weren't, she assured him. It's natural to be curious. She hesitated, then added, just as I'm curious about your life with Elijah. You seem different from what I might expect of a trapper's son. Thomas smiled. Elijah made sure of that. He taught me to read and write when I was small. We had 3 books in our cabina Bible, the Odyssey, and a volume of Shakespeare. I've read each of them dozens of times. Catherine's eyebrows rose in surprise. Elijah taught you Shakespeare? Thomas laughed. Not exactly. He can read well enough, but he's not one for poetry. He traded 6 beaver pelts for that book because I'd heard stories about it from a passing teacher and wouldn't stop asking questions. His expression grew thoughtful. He's always been like that, gruff and practical on the surface, but understanding what I needed. Even when I didn't, Catherine felt a new appreciation for the man who had raised her son. He sounds like a good father. The best, Thomas agreed without hesitation. Though sometimes I wonder why he chose this life for us. We could have settled in a town. He has skills, carpentry, tracking, even some doctoring, but he always kept us moving, kept us isolated. He shook his head. At least until we built the cabin at Bear Creek. Perhaps he felt safer in the wilderness, Catherine suggested gently. Thomas gave her a sharp look. Safer from what? Before Catherine could respond, Elijah's voice came from the hallway. Thomas, you bothering Mrs. Thornhill with questions? Thomas stood quickly. Bothering, just asking about my parents. Elisha appeared in the doorway, his expression stormy. Late Muzz. Carson has made up our beds. I'll be right there. Thomas turned to Catherine. Thank you for indulging my curiosity. Perhaps we can talk more tomorrow. I'd like that very much, Catherine replied warmly. After Thomas had gone, Elijah remained in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the exit. What did you tell him? Nothing that would upset him, Catherine assured him. Just general information about his parents, his coloring, his father's charm, his mother's devotion. Elijah's jaw tightened. This won't end well. He's always been too curious for his own good. He deserves to know his history, Catherine countered. Even the parts that are painful. What he deserves is peace. Elijah growled, not having his whole life upended because a woman he's never met has decided to claim him after 18 years. Catherine flinched at the harshness of his words. That's not fair, isn't it? Elijah stepped into the room, lowering his voice. You talk of what he deserves, but what about what he wants? He has a life, plans for his future. What right do you have to disrupt that? What right did you have to take him? Catherine shot back, rising to her feet. I told you I saved him, and I'm grateful, she insisted. But that doesn't give you ownership of him forever. He's a man now, capable of handling the truth and making his own decisions. Elijah stared at her for a long moment. And if he decides he wants nothing to do with you once he learns the truth, if he resents you for disrupting the only life he's ever known, have you considered that possibility? Catherine paled but held her ground. Yes, it would break my heart, but at least he would be choosing based on the truth, not a comfortable lie. There's nothing comfortable about the truth, Elijah said bitterly. Not in this case. A floorboard creaked in the hallway and they both turned to find Thomas standing there, his expression troubled. What truth? He asked quietly. What are you two arguing about? Elijah and Catherine exchanged alarmed glances, neither prepared for this confrontation. Nothing that can't wait until morning, Elijah said firmly. It's been a long day. Thomas shook his head. No, I've had enough of being treated like a child. Something's going on between you two, and it involves me. His gaze shifted to Catherine. Who are you really, Mrs. Thorne, and what do you want with us? The moment Catherine had both dreaded and longed for had arrived sooner than expected. She looked to Elijah, silently asking his permission to proceed. His face was grim, but after a moment he gave a barely perceptible nod. Catherine took a deep breath and reached for the locket around her neck. Perhaps you should sit down, Thomas. What I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about yourself and about the man who raised you. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes darting between Catherine and Elijah. The tension in the room was palpable, like the charged air before lightning strikes. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. I've spent my entire life with half-truths and vague answers, he said quietly. Whatever this is, I want to hear it. All of it. Catherine's hands trembled as she unclasped her locket. She opened it carefully, revealing the tiny lock of dark hair nestled inside. This was cut from your head when you were 6 months old, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the day before you were taken from me. Thomas stared at the locket, uncomprehending at first. Then his eyes widened as understanding dawned. What are you saying? I'm your mother, Thomas. The words Catherine had dreamed of saying for 18 years hung in the air between them. I didn't die. I've been searching for you all these years. Thomas took an involuntary step backward, his face draining of color. That's not possible, Elijah told me. He turned to the trapper, betrayal written across his features. You told me she was dead. Elijah's weathered face was etched with pain, but he didn't flinch from Thomas's accusation. I believe she would be, one way or another. The men hunting you both? Hunting us? Thomas interrupted, his voice rising. What men? What are you talking about? Catherine stepped toward him, one hand outstretched. Please sit down. Let us explain. Thomas ignored her gesture, turning back to Elijah. You. Explain. Now. Elijah drew a deep breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as if a great weight had finally settled fully upon them. Your father, George Thornhill, was a gambler, got himself deep in debt to a man named Harrison who ran the riverboats. Not just any debt, the kind a man doesn't walk away from. So he died over money? Thomas asked, his voice hollow. That part was true? Yes, Catherine confirmed softly. But that's not all. Elijah continued, his voice rough. Harrison was a collector, not just of money, but of people, children specifically. Orphans mostly, but sometimes children who were sold. Thomas's face contorted in disbelief. Sold? Catherine pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back a sob as the horrible truth was laid bare. Your father lost everything at Harrison's tables, Elijah said bluntly. Then, drunk and desperate, he offered the one thing of value he had left, his infant son and heir. No, Thomas whispered, shaking his head. That can't be true. I wish it weren't, Catherine said, tears now flowing freely. I didn't know Thomas. I swear to you I didn't know what he'd done. He told me he was taking you to visit his sister. I was working security on the riverboat, Elijah explained. I overheard the bargain being made. Your father sobered up enough to regret it and tried to back out of the deal. Harrison's men beat him and threw him overboard. Then they planned to collect you that night. So you took me first, Thomas concluded, his voice flat. Elijah nodded. I knew where you lived from the paperwork. I got there before Harrison's men. Found your mother unconscious, Lawton, Catherine interjected. For my headaches. I'd taken it not knowing what George was planning. I slept through everything. I found you crying in your cradle, Elijah continued. Harrison's men were less than an hour behind me. I had to make a choice. You chose to kidnap me, Thomas said, the words sharp as flint. I chose to save you, Elijah corrected, his voice firm despite the pain in his eyes. Harrison's men would have found you, taken you. You'd have disappeared into whatever hell he had planned for you. You could have taken both of us, Thomas argued, gesturing toward Catherine. You could have woken her, warned her. And then what? Elijah demanded. A woman alone with an infant, no money, no family support, running from men who wouldn't stop looking. How far would you have gotten? Catherine stepped forward. He's right, Thomas. As much as it pains me to admit it, he's right. I was barely more than a girl myself, sheltered and naive. My family had disowned me for marrying George. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Thomas turned away from them both, bracing his hands against the wall as if needing its support to remain standing. You just took me, disappeared with me, let her believe I was dead all these years. No, Catherine said quickly. I never believed you were dead. Not for a moment. When I woke to find you gone and men ransacking our home, I knew something terrible had happened. But I never gave up hope that you were alive somewhere. I meant to send word once we were safe, Elijah admitted. But Harrison's men tracked us halfway across Missouri. By the time I was sure we'd lost them, months had passed. You'd taken sick on the journey. I nearly lost you twice to fever, and by then then, Catherine added softly, my sister had had me committed to an asylum. The official story was that I'd lost my mind with grief. Thomas turned back to face them, his expression haunted. An asylum? For how long? 3 years, Catherine said, her chin lifting slightly. Until a doctor realized I wasn't insane, just determined to find my child. He helped me escape, get established under my maiden name in another city, and you've been looking for me ever since? Thomas asked, a note of wonder creeping into his voice beneath the shock. Catherine nodded. 15 years of searching, following every rumor, every lead, no matter how small. She stepped closer to him, though still not touching. I never stopped looking for you, Thomas. Never. A heavy silence filled the room as Thomas absorbed everything he'd heard. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, the storm a fitting backdrop to the emotional tempest within. Why Thomas? He finally asked, the question seemingly random. What? Catherine looked confused. My name. Is Thomas even my real name? Catherine glanced at Elijah, who nodded for her to answer. Your full name was Thomas George Thornhill, she said soft. After my father and your father. Elijah at least left you that much of your identity. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, his movements agitated. So my entire life has been built on lies. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family. Not everything. Elijah interrupted, his voice gruff with emotion. Not the things that matter. How can you say that? Thomas demanded. You stole me, Elijah. You let me believe my mother was dead when she's been searching for me all these years. I raised you, Elijah countered, a rare flash of anger breaking through his stoic exterior. I kept you safe, taught you to read, to hunt, to survive. I gave you everything I had. Was that a lie? Thomas faltered, clearly conflicted. No, but did I lie when I sat up with you 3 nights straight when you had mountain fever? When I taught you to shoot, to set a broken bone, to read the weather? Was any of that a lie, Thomas? Stop it, both of you, Catherine interjected, stepping between them. This isn't helping. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. You're truly my mother? Catherine's eyes welled with fresh tears. Yes, you have my eyes, my father's brow. She smiled tremulously. When you concentrate, you furrow your forehead just as I do. Almost involuntarily, Thomas touched his own forehead, then dropped his hand quickly. I don't know what to feel, he admitted, his voice raw. I've spent my whole life wondering about you, my mother creating an image in my mind. And now you're here, alive, a real person standing in front of me, and I don't know what to do with that. You don't have to do anything right now, Catherine assured him. Just know that I love you. I've loved you every day since you were born. I never stopped, not for a moment. Thomas shook his head, overwhelmed. I need time to think. This is all, too much. He looked at Elijah, a mixture of hurt and confusion in his eyes. All these years you could have told me the truth, and what good would that have done? Elijah asked quietly. Knowing your father sold you? That your mother might still be out there somewhere if she hadn't been locked away, or worse. Would that have made your childhood happier, Thomas? It would have been honest, Thomas insisted. It would have been cruel, Elijah countered. You were a child. I did what I thought best. Not your decision to make, Thomas said. But some of the heat had gone out of his voice, replaced by exhaustion. Catherine sensed his withdrawal. Perhaps we should all get some rest. The storm has us trapped here for now. We'll have time to talk more tomorrow when we've all had a chance to calm our thoughts. Thomas nodded mechanically, his eyes distant. Yes, tomorrow. Without another word, he opened the door and left the room, his footsteps heavy down the hallway. Catherine and Elijah stood in silence for several moments after he'd gone. That went about as well as could be expected, Elijah finally said, his attempt at wry humor falling flat. Catherine sank onto the bed, suddenly exhausted. He hates us both now. He's confused. Elijah corrected her, angry, hurt. But Thomas isn't one to hate easily. A touch of pride colored his voice despite everything. He has a good heart, always has. You've done well with him, Catherine acknowledged quietly. I can see that. Elijah moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. He's been my whole life for 18 years, Mrs. Thornhill. The only family I've had. His voice roughened. I won't apologize for the choices I made, but I am sorry for your suffering. No mother should endure what you have. Before Catherine could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of revelations and uncertain tomorrows. She clutched her locket, finally empty of its precious cargo now that its purpose had been served. For 18 years, she had been driven by a single goal, find her son. Now that she had accomplished that impossible task, Catherine faced a new and perhaps more daunting challenge, becoming a mother to a son who had grown up without her, and who might never forgive the circumstances of their separation. Dawn broke gray and muffled over Fort Willow, the storm having temporarily exhausted itself during the night. Snow lay piled in towering drifts against buildings, transforming the small settlement into a landscape of white mounds and narrow pathways hastily shoveled between structures. The world felt hushed, as if holding its breath before the next onslaught. Thomas stood at the window in the small room he shared with Elijah, though he had barely slept. The trapper's bed was empty. Elijah had risen before first light and disappeared, likely to check on their horses in the stable behind Mrs. Carson's cabin. His mind kept circling back to the revelations of the previous night, each truth more staggering than the last. His father had sold him. His mother hadn't died, but had spent years searching for him. The man who had raised him, the only constant in his life, had built their relationship on fundamental lies. The medallion felt heavy against his chest. He pulled it out, studying it with new understanding. Not just some trinket from an anonymous past, but a Thornhill family heirloom, its birthright. Evidence of the life that had been stolen from him, more saved. saved, depending on whose version of events he believed. The door opened behind him, and he quickly tucked the medallion away, expecting Elijah. Instead, Mrs. Carson entered with a tray of breakfast. "Thought you might be hungry, young man," she said, setting the tray on the room's small table. "You missed supper last night." Thomas hadn't even thought about food. "Thank you, Mrs. Carson, that's very kind." The widow studied him with sharp eyes that missed little. "Something's troubling you. Been walking on eggshells around this cabin since I got up. You and your father have a falling out?" Thomas flinched at the word father. ... Complicated. Mrs. Carson snorted softly. "Most important things are." She poured a cup of coffee and handed it. "That woman, Mrs. Thornhill, she's got something to do with it, I reckon." Thomas took the cup gratefully, warming his hands around it. "You could say that." The widow nodded sagely. "Figured as much. Way she looks at you, ... Reminded me of something I ain't seen in a long while." She patted his arm. "Whatever's happened, best to face it head on. Troubles are like wolves. They'll circle you forever if you show fear. But stand your ground and they might just skulk away." After Mrs. Carson left, Thomas forced himself to eat, knowing he needed strength for whatever lay ahead. As he finished the last of the bacon, the door opened again. This time it was Catherine. She hesitated at the threshold. "May I come in?" Thomas nodded stiffly, setting down his coffee cup. "Mrs. Carson said the storm might let up by tomorrow. The pass could be clear enough to travel by afternoon." Catherine stepped inside, closing the door part way but leaving it ajar. She looked as though she'd slept as little as Thomas had, her eyes shadowed but determined. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. "To leave as soon as possible?" Thomas turned back to the window. "I don't know what I want anymore." "That's understandable." She remained near the door, giving him space. "When I first learned what had happened, that George had taken you to the riverboat, that you'd disappeared, I couldn't think clearly for days. Everything I thought I knew had shattered." Thomas glanced at her. "How did you find out the truth? About what my father, what George had done?" Catherine's expression dark. "Harrison's men returned to our house looking for you. One of them let it slip during their search, taunting me, I think. Said George had made a deal he couldn't keep, and now they'd come to collect." She shuddered at the memory. "When I became hysterical, demanding to know what he meant, he told me George had wagered something more valuable than money. That's when I knew. And then they just left, without harming you?" "They believed I was hiding you somewhere in the house," Catherine explained. "They tore the place apart, threatened me, but eventually concluded you truly were gone. One of them suggested Elijah might have taken you. They'd noticed him missing from his post that night." Thomas's brow furrowed. "But they didn't pursue you after that?" "They did, but not for long." She moved a few steps closer, her hands clasped tightly together. "My sister Caroline arrived the next day and found me in a state of complete hysteria. I was raving about George selling you, about you being kidnapped. She thought I'd lost my mind with grief. Perhaps I had in a way." Her voice grew softer. "She arranged for me to be taken to a private asylum upstate for my own protection," she said. Perhaps she even believed it. 3 years, Thomas murmured, recalling what she'd told him the night before. Catherine nodded. 3 years in that place, insisting that my son was alive somewhere, that I had to find him. They thought it was delusion. The doctors were kind enough, but firm in their conviction that accepting your death was the only path to my recovery. How did you escape?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. "Dr. Bennett, the youngest physician there. He listened when no one else would. Eventually he came to believe that I wasn't delusional, just desperate. He arranged for my release to a cousin in Boston, helped me establish myself under my maiden name." Her eyes filled with unshed tears. "He was the first person in years who treated me like a sane woman with a legitimate grievance rather than a mad woman with dangerous fantasies." Thomas absorbed this, trying to imagine the determination it must have taken to persist in her search despite such obstacles. "And afterward, how did you track us?" Slowly, painfully. Catherine moved to the other chair and sat down, the fatigue of her long quest evident in the slope of her shoulders. "I took work as a music teacher, saving every penny I could. When I had enough, I'd travel to follow a lead, hire an investigator when possible. Most trails led nowhere." Her fingers unconsciously sought her now empty locket, "but I couldn't stop. The thought of you out there somewhere, not knowing who you truly were, not knowing you were loved and missed, it kept me going when everything else failed." Thomas felt something shift inside him, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "How did you finally find us, after all this time?" "A fur buyer in St. Louis," Catherine explained. "He mentioned a trapper named Blackwood who'd appeared years ago with an infant boy. It was the first time I'd heard the name Blackwood connected to a child." She shook her head in wonder. "All these years I've been searching for a man with a boy named Thomas, never knowing Elijah had changed his surname." "He didn't change my first name," Thomas noted, remembering what she'd told him the night before. "Thomas George Thornhill." "No." Catherine smiled sadly. "At least he left you that connection to your past." Before Thomas could respond, heavy footsteps sounded in the hallway and Elijah appeared in the doorway. His face was reddened from the cold snow still clinging to his beard and the shoulders of his buckskin. "Trails completely blocked," he announced gruffly. "The sheriff says we're looking at 3 days minimum before anyone's going anywhere." The tension in the room thickened at his arrival. Thomas stood abruptly, needing to escape the suffocating pressure of being caught between these two people who both, in different ways, claimed him as their own. "I need some air," he muttered, pushing past Elijah into the hallway. "Thomas!" Elijah called after him, but Thomas kept walking, grabbing his coat from a hook by the door before stepping outside into the bitter cold. The shock of the frigid air against his face was a relief after the stifling atmosphere inside. He trudged through snow that reached mid-calf, no destination in mind, just needing movement and space to think. He found himself behind the stables, where a small overhang provided shelter from the worst of the snow. Leaning against the rough wooden wall, Thomas closed his eyes and tried to make sense of his churning emotions. Anger at Elijah's deception warred with gratitude for the life the trapper had given him. Sympathy for Catherine's suffering conflicted with resentment that she had suddenly appeared to append his entire understanding of himself, and beneath it all, a bone-deep confusion about who he truly was. Thomas Black, son of a mountain trapper, or Thomas Thornhill, heir to a family he'd never known. He didn't hear the approach of footsteps until Elijah was nearly upon him. The older man said nothing at first, just stood beside Thomas in the silence, both of them watching their breath cloud in the cold air. "I figure you've got questions," Elijah finally said, his voice low. "Things you didn't ask last night in the heat of it all." Thomas kept his eyes on the distant mountains, barely visible through the gray sky and intermittent snowfall. "Did you ever plan to tell me the truth? Or was I supposed to live my whole life not knowing?" Elijah sighed heavily. "I told myself that when you were grown, truly grown, with a life of your own, I'd tell you everything. Whether I'd have had the courage to do it, single quotes," he shrugged. "I like to think so, but you're not sure," Thomas concluded flatly. "No," Elijah admitted, "I'm not sure." The longer it went on, the harder it got to imagine saying the words. They stood in silence for another minute before Thomas asked the question that had been haunting him since the previous night. "Why did you do it? Really? Was it just to save me from Harrison's men, or was there more to—" Elijah's weathered face creased with an emotion Thomas couldn't quite name, something between pain and resignation. "When I saw your father make that bargain, something inside me broke. My own father sold me, in a manner of speaking. Indenture, they called it. But it was 7 years of hell that left me with these scars." He gestured to the thin white lines visible at his neck. "I couldn't stand by and let another child suffer that fate. Not when I could prevent it." "So you took me," Thomas said, "but why keep me? Why not find some family to take me in once we were safe?" Elijah was quiet for so long that Thomas thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion rarely displayed. "Because by then you were mine. Not by blood, but by choice. By love." He cleared his throat. "I never planned to be a father, never thought I had it in me. But from that first night when you stopped crying the moment I picked you up, something changed. For the first time in my life, someone needed me, trusted me completely." The raw honesty in Elijah's voice struck Thomas deeply. Whatever else the man had done, whatever lies he had told, this fundamental truth rang clearly. Elijah had loved him, had chosen him when no one else would or could. "She suffered," Thomas said quietly. "My mother, Catherine, she never stopped looking for me." Elijah nodded solemnly. "I see that now. I didn't think, I convinced myself she'd have moved on, started a new life, maybe had other children. It was easier than imagining her searching, grieving." He looked directly at Thomas. "I was wrong about that. I can admit it." Thomas pushed away from the wall, suddenly restless again. "I don't know how to reconcile any of this. How to be both people at once. The son you raised and the son she lost." "You don't have to decide today," Elijah said. "The storms bought us time. Use it." As Thomas turned to go, Elijah added, "Whatever you decide, whatever you feel about what I did, know that I've never regretted a single day of raising you. Not one." Thomas paused, the weight of those words settling on him. Without turning back, he nodded once, then continued through the snow toward the cabin, his mind no clearer but his heart somehow lighter for having heard the truth in Elijah's voice. By midday, the sky had cleared enough for weak winter sunlight to gleam across the snow-blanketed settle. Despite Sheriff Holt's predictions, the trails remained impassable, the entire community of Fort Willow effectively isolated until the weather permitted travel once more. Catherine stood at the window of Mrs. Carson's kitchen, watching as men shoveled paths between buildings. Her conversation with Thomas that morning had left her feeling both hopeful and heartsick. Hopeful that he might eventually come to accept her as his mother. Heartsick at the years of his life she had missed, years that could never be reclaimed. "Penny for your thoughts," Mrs. Carson said, coming to stand beside her. The widow handed Catherine a steaming cup of tea. "Thank you," Catherine murmured, accepting the cup gratefully. "I was just thinking how strange life can be. How unpredictable." Mrs. Carson's sharp eyes studied her face. "Something tells me you didn't end up in my cabin by accident, Mrs. Thornhill." Catherine glanced at her, wondering how much the perceptive widow had deduced. "No," she admitted softly, "not by accident." Mrs. Carson nodded, seemingly satisfied with this confirmation of her suspicion. "That young man, Thomas, he's a good boy. Got a level head on his shoulders, unlike most his age." She busied herself with the dough she was kneading. "Blackwood's done right by him, whatever else might be said." "Yes," Catherine agreed, surprising herself with the sincerity of her response. "He has." The front door opened, letting in a blast of cold air along with Elijah, who stomped snow from his boots on the threshold. His eyes found Catherine immediately, and a silent communication passed between, a shared concern for the young man they both loved in different ways. "Thomas?" Catherine asked quietly. "At the trading post with Miller," Elijah replied, unwinding his scarf, helping sort out some water damage from the snow. "Said he needed time to think." Mrs. Carson clucked her tongue. "That boy's had enough thinking time. What he needs is answers." She looked pointedly between Catherine and Elijah. "And from both of you, I'd wager." Elijah frowned at the widow's perceptiveness but didn't contradict her. Instead, he turned to Catherine. "Walk with me to the post. We should check on him." Catherine set down her cup, grateful for the invitation despite its pragmatic nature. Of course, they bundled up against the cold and stepped out into the snow-covered yard. Neither spoke as they made their way along the freshly shoveled path toward the trading post at the center of the fort. The silence between them was uneasy but no longer openly hostile, a truce born of their shared concern for Thomas. "He's angry with me," Elijah finally said as they neared the trading post. "Has every right to be." Catherine glanced at him, surprised by the admission. "He's angry with both of us, I think. Me for appearing suddenly to complicate his life. You for the deception." Elijah grunted in acknowledgement. "He'll forgive you faster. You're his blood." "Blood isn't everything," Catherine replied softly. "You've been his father in all the ways that matter for 18 years. That bond doesn't dissolve overnight." Elijah looked at her sharply, clearly taken aback by her words. Before he could respond, they reached the trading post. Through the window they could see Thomas inside, helping Miller move crates away from a snow-damaged section of wall. "He was always like that," Elijah said, pausing before they entered. "Even as a little boy, first to offer help, last to complain about the work." Catherine smiled faintly, hungry for these glimpses into the years she'd missed. "What was he like? As a child, I mean?" Something in Elijah's expression softened. "Curious about everything. Always asking questions I didn't have answers for. Quick to learn, quicker to forgive." A rare smile touched his lips. "Had a habit of collecting strays, injured birds, orphaned rabbit kits. Nursed most of them back to health before setting them free again. He gets that from my father," Catherine said, a bittersweet ache in her chest. "He was a doctor, always bringing home patients who couldn't afford care, treating them in our parlor." For a moment they stood together. Two people who had loved the same child in vastly different ways, finding an unexpected common ground in their shared memories and observation. The moment was broken when the door to the trading post swung open, and Thomas himself emerged, stopping short when he saw them standing together. "Everything all right?" he asked wearily. "Just came to check on you," Elijah said. "Make sure Miller wasn't working you too hard." Single quotes. Thomas's expression remained guarded, but some of the tension in his shoulders eased. "I'm fine. Helping keeps my mind occupied." Catherine resisted the urge to reach out to him, knowing such a gesture would not be welcomed yet. "Mrs. Carson is preparing supper. Said it would be ready in an hour or so." Thomas nodded, glancing between them. "I was actually hoping to speak with you, Cat, alone, if that's all right." Surprise and hope flared in Catherine's chest. "Of course." Elijah shifted uncomfortably but made no objection. "I'll help the sheriff clear the north path. Carson's got some medical supplies he's been waiting for." With a nod to them both, he turned and trudged away through the snow. Thomas watched him go, his expression troubled. "He's giving us space." "Not like him. He's trying," Catherine said gently. "For your sake." Thomas turned back to her. "There's somewhere I'd like to show you, if you don't mind a short walk through the snow." "Curious," Catherine nodded. "Lead the way." They walked in silence away from the cluster of buildings that formed the heart of Fort Willow, following a narrow path that wound behind the stables toward a small rise. At the top stood a single pine tree, its branches heavy with snow, and beneath it a crude wooden bench half buried in white. "I found this place yesterday," Thomas explained as they reached the top. "You can see the whole settlement from here." He brushed snow from the bench, creating a space for them to sit, and it's quiet. Catherine settled beside him, mindful to leave some space between. From this vantage point, Fort Willow looked even smaller, a fragile outpost of civilization in the vast wilderness that stretched in all directions. "When I was little," Thomas began, his voice soft, maybe 5 or 6, "I found a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree after a storm. 3 baby birds, barely alive. Elijah told me they wouldn't survive, that nature had made its decision, but I insisted on trying to save them." He smiled faintly at the memory. "I stayed up all night, feeding them with an eyedropper we'd traded for, keeping them warm. 2 died by morning, but 1 survived. I raised it until it could fly, then set it free." Catherine listened, treasuring this glimpse into his childhood. "Elijah never said I told you so about the ones that died," Thomas and he helped me care for the one that lived, even though he thought it was hopeless at first." He turned to face her. "That's who he is. Practical, sometimes harsh, but willing to support what matters to me. He loves you very much," Catherine said softly. Thomas nodded, his eyes distant. "Last night, after everything came out, I was so angry I could hardly see straight. I felt betrayed, lied to." He paused. "But today I started thinking about what would have happened if he hadn't taken me that night. If Harrison's men had found me instead." Catherine shuddered at the thought. "I've had the same nightmare for 18 years. Elijah saved me," Thomas acknowledged. "Whatever his reasons, whatever mistakes he made afterward, he saved my life that night." He looked down at his hands, strong and calloused from years of work beside the trapper, "and he gave me a good life. Different from what it might have been, but good." "I can see that," Catherine said, emotion thickening her voice. "You're a fine young man, Thomas. Anyone would be proud to call you son." Thomas was quiet for a moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I have questions about my family. Your family, about who I would have been if things had gone differently." "Ask me anything," Catherine urged. "I want you to know everything about your heritage. My grandparents, Your parents? Catherine smiled, grateful for this opening. Your grandfather was Dr. William Hayes, one of the most respected physicians in St. Louis. Your grandmother, Eleanor, was known for her charity work with orphan children. They had 2 daughters, myself and Caroline, the aunt who had you committed, Thomas noted. Catherine nodded, old pain flickering across her features. Caroline was always practical, concerned with appearances. When I fell in love with George Thornhill, she disapproved. He was handsome and charming, but from a family without means or connections, she sighed. My parents cut me off when I married him against their wishes. They died in a carriage accident before you were born, never having reconciled with me, so I never knew them, Thomas said softly. No, but they would have loved you, Catherine assured him. You have my father's eyes. His intelligence, too, from what I've seen. Thomas absorbed this information, constructing a mental image of the family he'd never known. And on my father's side, Catherine's expression grew more guarded. The Thornhills were ... complicated. George's father was a riverboat captain who lost everything to gambling, much like George himself eventually did. There was a pattern there I was too naive to recognize. She hesitated. George had a brother, your Uncle James, who tried to warn me about George's habits. I didn't listen. Is he still alive? My uncle? I don't know, Catherine admitted. We lost touch after George's death. Last I heard, he'd moved west to California during the gold rush. They sat in contemplative silence for a few minutes, the cold air crystallizing their breath. In the distance, smoke rose from Mrs. Carson's chimney, a reminder of warmth and shelter waiting for them. There's so much to learn, Thomas finally said. So many pieces of myself I never knew existed. We have time, Catherine said gently. The storm has given us that, at least. Thomas turned to her, his expression serious. What happens when the storm clears? When the pass is open? The question Catherine had been dreading hung between them. That depends on you, Thomas. I won't force myself into your life if you don't want me there, but I won't disappear either. Not again. And Elijah? What about him? Catherine chose her words carefully. Elijah will always be your father in ways I can never dispute or replace. I don't want to take you from him. I just want ... a place in your life, however small. Thomas nodded slowly, some decision seeming to crystallize within him. I need to speak with Elijah, alone. He stood, brushing snow from his clothes, and then perhaps the 3 of us should talk about the future. As they made their way back down the hill toward Fort Willow, Catherine felt both hope and trepidation. The path forward was as uncertain as the weather, but for the first time in 18 years, she dared to believe that her son might find a way to accept both the mother who had lost him and the father who had raised him. Thomas found Elijah behind the sheriff's office, splitting firewood with methodical precision. Each swing of the axe seemed to carry the weight of the trapper's thoughts, the blade biting deep into the pine logs before Elijah wrenched it free for another strike. Snow had been cleared from a small area, the packed earth beneath dusted with sawdust and splinters. For a moment, Thomas simply watched the man who had raised him. Elijah's movements were as familiar to him as his own, the slight hitch in his left shoulder from an old injury, the way he positioned his feet for maximum leverage, the controlled power of each swing. How many times had Thomas observed these same motions throughout his childhood, learning by example the skills that would shape him into the man he had become? You gonna stand there all day, or did you come to help? Elijah asked without turning around, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier defensive edge. Thomas stepped forward, catching the axe Elijah tossed him with practiced ease. They worked side by side for several minutes, falling into the comfortable rhythm developed over years of shared labor. The physical activity provided a welcome outlet for Thomas's conflicted emotions, each strike of the axe releasing a fraction of the tension that had knotted inside him since Catherine's arrival. I spoke with her, Thomas finally said, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow despite the cold. About my family. Her family. Elijah nodded, not interrupting his work. And I have grandparents I never knew. An aunt who sounds terrible. An uncle somewhere in California, maybe? Thomas split another log cleanly down the middle. A whole history I've never been part of. That bothers you, Elijah observed, his tone neutral. Thomas set down the axe, suddenly needing to face this conversation directly. Wouldn't it bother you to discover that everything you thought you knew about yourself was only half the story? Elijah straightened, his breath clouding in the cold air. He regarded Thomas thoughtfully, seeming to weigh his response. When I was younger than you are now, he finally said, I learned that the man who raised me wasn't my father by blood. My mother confessed it on her deathbed. Thomas stared at him, stunned. In all their years together, Elijah had never shared this piece of his past. He never told me that. Never seemed relevant. Elijah leaned the axe against the chopping block. The man who raised me was the only father I knew. Finding out he wasn't my blood didn't change what he'd been. That's different, Thomas argued. Your mother didn't lie to you about who you were. No, Elijah conceded. But my point is that blood isn't what makes family, Thomas. Never has been. Thomas absorbed this, recognizing the truth in Elijah's words even through his lingering anger. She suffered, he said quietly. Catherine. All these years searching for me while I grew up not even knowing she existed. I see that now, Elijah admitted, his weathered face somber. I convinced myself she'd have moved on, found a new life. It was easier than facing what I'd done to her. The frank acknowledgement of wrongdoing, so rare from the stoic trapper, caught Thomas off guard. For the first time, he saw genuine remorse in Elijah's eyes. Would you have done it differently? Thomas asked. If you could go back to that night knowing everything you know now? Elijah considered the question seriously. I'd still have taken you from that house, he said finally. Harrison's men would have found you otherwise, but ... single quotes. He hesitated. I might have found a way to let her know you were safe. Once we were clear, once I was sure no one was following. Why didn't you? Fear, mostly, Elijah admitted. Fear that Harrison's men might trace any message back to us. Fear that they might use her to find you. His voice roughened. And later, selfishness. By then you were mine. I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. The raw honesty in Elijah's voice struck Thomas deeply. And now? How do you feel about her being here, wanting to be part of my life? Elijah looked away, his gaze settling on the distant mountains. Scared, he admitted gruffly. Scared you won't need me anymore. Scared you'll hate me for what I did. He turned back to Thomas, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability rarely displayed. But mostly I'm sorry. Sorry for what she lost. Sorry for the choice I made that cost her 18 years with her son. Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the significance of Elijah's word. The trapper had never been one for apologies or admissions of error, preferring to let his actions speak for him. This acknowledgement of regret represented a profound shift. She doesn't want to take me away from you, Thomas said quietly. She told me that herself. Surprise flickered across Elijah's face. That's generous of her. She understands what you've been. Thomas picked up another log, turning it in his hands rather than splitting it. She says you'll always be my father in ways she can never dispute. Elijah absorbed this information, clearly taken aback by Catherine's perspective. What do you want, Thomas? He asked finally. Now that you know everything, what do you want to happen? It was the question Thomas had been asking himself since the truth had come to light. I don't know, he admitted. I can't just forget the life we've built, the years you've raised, but I can't ignore her either. Who she is to me, what she's suffered to find me. He set the log down with a heavy thud. I feel torn between two worlds. Two lives that should have been one. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Maybe they still can be, he suggested. Thomas looked at him questioningly. One life, Elijah clarified. Not Blackwood or Thornhill, just Thomas. He gestured vaguely toward the trading post where Catherine was likely waiting. She's your blood. I'm the one who raised you. Maybe there's room for both of us in your life if that's what you want. The suggestion, tentative as it was, represented a monumental concession from the fiercely independent trapper who had kept Thomas isolated for most of his life. Thomas felt a surge of gratitude and respect for the effort it must have cost Elijah to make such an offer. You'd be willing to try that? Thomas asked. To share ... whatever this is ... with her? I'd be willing to try, Elijah confirmed, though uncertainty shadowed his eyes. For your sake, Thomas nodded slowly, a sense of possibility beginning to replace his earlier confusion. Then I think we should talk, all three of us, about what happens next. As they gathered the split wood into a pile, a figure approached through the snow. It was Miller from the trading post, his expression troubled. Blackwood, he called. Got some news you might want to hear. Elijah straightened, instantly alert to the trader's tone. What is it? Miller glanced at Thomas, then back to Elijah. Riders came through from the south before the storm hit. Left word at Carson's that didn't reach me till now. He lowered his voice. Harrison's dead. Thomas felt Elijah stiffen beside him. When? The trapper demanded. 6 months back. Riverboat explosion. Some say accident, some say not. Miller shuffled his feet in the snow. Thing is, his son's taken over the business. Word is he's more ruthless than his father ever was. And Elijah pressed, sensing there was more. Miller looked uncomfortable, and he's been asking questions about an old debt of his father's, about a man named Blackwood who disappeared from Missouri with something valuable ago. The implications of Miller's words hung in the frigid air between them. Thomas felt a cold that had nothing to do with the winter seep into his bones. How'd they trace us here? Elijah asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Miller shook his head. Don't know. But those riders were showing your description around before the storm hit. Said they'd be back once the pass is cleared. We need to leave, Elijah said immediately, turning to Thomas. Pack only what we can carry on horseback. We'll head deeper into the mountains until spring. No, Thomas interrupted, the word firm and decisive. I'm done running from a past I didn't even know was chasing me. Elijah's expression hardened. This isn't about the past, Thomas. Harrison's son is dangerous. If he's anything like his father, he won't stop until he gets what he wants. And what does he want? Thomas challenged. Me? After 18 years? What possible value could I have to him now? Revenge, Elijah said grimly. The debt was never about money. It was about power, control. His father couldn't stand to lose. And from what Miller says, the son is cut from the same cloth. Thomas shook his head, a new resolve settling over him. I'm not a child anymore, Elijah. I won't spend my life looking over my shoulder for threats from the past. This isn't a game, Elijah growled, frustration coloring his voice. These men, I know it's not a game, Thomas interrupted, but I'm tired of decisions being made for me based on fears I'm not allowed to understand. He turned to Miller. Did these riders leave a message? A name? Anything we could use to contact them? Miller shifted uncomfortably under Elijah's glare. Said they were staying in Broken Pine when the weather cleared. Asked for word to be sent if anyone matching Blackwood's description showed up. Thomas nodded decisively. Then that's where I'll go. To meet them, to end this, whatever this is, once and for all. Absolutely not, Elijah said, his voice like steel. I didn't keep you safe for 18 years just for you to walk straight into their hands. Not your decision anymore, Thomas replied, his tone gentle but firm. I appreciate everything you've done to protect me, but I need to face this on my terms. They stared at each other, the impasse between them as solid as the mountains surrounding Fort Willow. Miller cleared his throat awkwardly. I'll leave you two to discuss it, he said, backing away through the snow. Just thought you should know. As Miller departed, Thomas turned back to Elijah, his expression resolute. We should tell Catherine. She deserves to know what's happening. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he nodded reluctantly. Fine, but this discussion isn't over. Together they walked toward Mrs. Carson's cabin, the news hanging heavily between them. The brief sense of possibility that had emerged during their conversation had been eclipsed by a more immediate threat, the long reach of the past, stretching into the present, threatening to destroy the fragile understanding they had begun to build. As they approached the cabin, Thomas caught sight of Catherine through the window, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the hearth. She looked up as if sensing their presence, her expression brightening momentarily before registering the gravity in their bearing. Whatever comes next, Thomas said quietly as they reached the door. We face it together, all three of us. Elijah gave him a long, measuring look, then nodded once. A silent acknowledgement that, for better or worse, their fates were now irrevocably intertwined. Catherine's face paled as Elijah related Miller's news. The three of them sat around Mrs. Carson's kitchen table, their voices low to prevent the widow from overhearing in the adjacent room. Harrison, Catherine whispered, the name alone causing her to shudder. After all these years, I thought we were finally free of that shadow. We never truly were, Elijah said grimly. I've always known they might still be looking. It's why we moved so often when Thomas was young, why we settled so deep in the mountains. Thomas sat between them, his face set in determined lines that reminded Catherine so strongly of his father that it made her heart ache. Not the weakness that had ultimately destroyed George, but the stubborn courage that had first drawn her to him. Tell me about Harrison, Thomas said, directing his question to Catherine. Everything you know. I want to understand what we're facing. Catherine gathered her thoughts, reaching back into memories she had tried for years to suppress. Victor Harrison owned 3 riverboats when I knew him. Gambling boats, ostensibly legitimate, but everyone knew he ran more than card games. His men operated throughout St. Louis protection rackets, smuggling, worse things whispered about but never proven. And his son? Elijah prompted. Malcolm, Catherine supplied, her lips thinning. A few years younger than George. Even then, he had a reputation for cruelty. He handled the ... collections. When debts weren't paid, her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. There were rumors that people who crossed the Harrisons sometimes disappeared. Their bodies would turn up in the Mississippi if they turned up at all. Thomas absorbed this information, his expression grave. And now he's taken over his father's business. But why come after us after 18 years? What could he possibly want with me now? It's not about you, Elijah said bluntly. Not really. It's about what you represented. Debt unpaid, a possession stolen, a slight to the Harrison name. I am not a possession, Thomas said, his voice hardening. Of course not, Catherine agreed quickly. But men like the Harrisons don't see people, they see assets and liability, pieces to be moved in their games of power. What exactly did my father promise them? Thomas asked, the question directed at both Catherine and Elijah. What was the bargain? Catherine and Elijah exchanged uncomfortable glances. Harrison collected children, Elijah finally said, his voice rough. Orphans, mostly. Sometimes children sold to cover debts. He had connections in the East, wealthy families willing to pay handsomely for healthy children to raise as their own. Some went to factories or mines, others ... single quotes, trailed off, unwilling to voice darker possibilities. Human trafficking, Catherine supplied, the modern term for an ancient evil. Harrison presented it as adoption, as charity, even taking unwanted children and finding them homes. But it was business. Cruel and calculating. Her voice caught. When I learned what George had done ... I couldn't believe he'd sink so low, no matter how desperate. Thomas stood abruptly, pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal. So my father sold me like livestock, and now Harrison's son wants to collect his property. His voice was tight with suppressed rage. After 18 years. It doesn't make sense. Power rarely makes sense to those without it, Catherine said softly. Malcolm Harrison would see this as reclaiming what belongs to his family, making a statement that no one escapes the Harrison reach, no matter how much time passes. Thomas turned to Elijah. You worked security for them. What do you know about their methods, their weaknesses? Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering. Harrison Sr. was careful, calculating. From what Miller says, the son is more impulsive, more direct. That could work against him. He stroked his beard thoughtfully. They'd expect us to run, to hide deeper in the mountains or head west. They wouldn't expect us to confront them directly, which is exactly what I intend to do, Thomas stated firmly. Thomas? No, Catherine protested. These men are dangerous. I'm not a child anymore, Thomas reminded her. And I won't spend the rest of my life running from threats I don't fully understand. He's right, Elijah said unexpectedly, earning a startled look from Catherine. Running would only delay the inevitable. Sooner or later they'd find us again. So you're suggesting we just ... what? Ride to Broken Pine and confront Malcolm Harrison and his men? Catherine's voice rose with incredulity. That's suicide? Not if we're smart about it, Elijah countered. Not if we have a plan. He turned to Thomas. You said you wanted to face this on your terms. What are those terms? Thomas considered the question, his gray eyes, so like his mother's, thoughtful. I want to end this permanently. No more looking over our shoulders, no more running. I want to negotiate from a position of strength, not fear. Negotiate? Catherine repeated, surprised by his approach. What could you possibly offer Harrison that would satisfy his vendetta? Thomas fingered the medallion beneath his shirt. Information. Leverage. Every successful businessman has secrets he'd prefer to keep hidden. Harrison's operations can't all be legal, even with whatever protection he's bought. Elijah nodded slowly. During my time working the riverboats, I saw things, records, transactions, names of officials on Harrison's payroll. Nothing I could prove, but enough to know where to start looking. That was 18 years ago, Catherine pointed out. Those officials could be gone. Those operations long since changed. The names might have changed, but the game hasn't, Elijah countered. Corruption leaves trails. If Malcolm is continuing his father's business, he's continuing those relationships, those patterns. Thomas sat back down, leaning forward intently. We need to learn everything we can about the current operations before the pass is clear. Miller must have connections. Traders who bring goods from Broken Pine and beyond. Sheriff Holt would know something too, Elijah added. He keeps tabs on all the larger operations in the territory. Catherine looked between them, her maternal instincts screaming that they were walking into danger, while her rational mind acknowledged the logic of their approach. Even if you gather this information, what's to stop Harrison from simply killing you all and eliminating the threat? Public scrutiny, Thomas suggests. If we make it known that evidence of Harrison's illegal activities exists and would be released upon our deaths, a dead man's switch, Elijah nodded approvingly. Insurance. It could work, Catherine admitted reluctantly, but it's incredibly risky, and it relies on Harrison being rational rather than vengeful, which is why we need a backup plan, Thomas agreed. Something more ... direct. Elijah's expression darkened. I won't let it come to violence if we can avoid it, but if it does ... Single quotes, he left the implication hanging. Catherine studied the two men before her, one young and idealistic, despite his determination, the other weathered and pragmatic, both willing to risk everything to protect what they valued. In that moment, she saw clearly what bound them beyond blood or circumstance. A fundamental integrity that neither hardship nor fear could erode. If we're going to do this, she said finally, we do it together. No one acts alone. Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. The gesture, the first he had initiated between them, sent a wave of emotion through Catherine, so powerful she almost couldn't speak. Together, he agreed, then looked to Elijah. All three of us. Elijah hesitated, then nodded once. A decisive movement that seemed to settle something within him. 3 days until the pass is clear, according to Sheriff Holt. We'll use that time to gather what we need. Information, supplies, allies if possible. I have some savings, Catherine offered. Not a fortune, but enough to bribe officials or purchase supplies if needed. And I have skills, Elijah added grimly. Tracking, hunting, reading men's intentions. I have both your blood and your raising, Thomas said, looking between them. And a stake in this fight. Neither of you can claim my own future, free from the shadow of Harrison, as if summoned by their planning. Mrs. Carson entered the kitchen with an armful of firewood. She looked between the three of them, noting their serious expressions and close positions around the table. Making plans, are we? She asked shrewdly. Just talking about the future, Thomas replied, his tone carefully neutral. Miss Carson snorted softly. Future past, seems to me they're all tangled up in this room. She set down the wood beside the stove. Sheriff says the North Pass might clear sooner than expected. Weather's shifting. Elijah stood, his movements decisive. Then we need to move quickly. Miller first, then the sheriff. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. I'll come with you, Thomas said, rising as well. Catherine watched them prepare to leave, emotion thick in her throat. After 18 years of searching, she had found her son only to face the prospect of losing him again, this time to the very danger Elijah had saved him from as an infant. Thomas, she called as they reached the door. He turned back, his expression questioning. Be careful, he smiled, the gesture transforming his serious face into something achingly familiar. Georgia's dimple, her father's eyes, all uniquely combined in this remarkable young man she was only beginning to know. Always am, he assured her, an echo of the easy confidence she'd heard in his voice when he spoke to Elijah. As the door closed behind them, Catherine remained at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her empty locket. For the first time since finding Thomas, she allowed herself to contemplate the possibility that their reunion might be as brief as their original separation had been sudden. The thought was unbearable. Mrs. Carson settled into the chair Elijah had vacated, her shrewd eyes kind but penetrating. Those two are plotting something foolish, aren't they? Brave, perhaps, Catherine corrected softly. But yes, possibly foolish as well. The widow nodded sagely. Men are like that. Especially the good, think they have to carry the world on their shoulders. She patted Catherine's hand, but they forget that a woman's shoulders are just as strong in their own way. Catherine met the older woman's gaze, drawing strength from her matter-of-fact courage. Yes, she agreed, determination replacing fear in her heart. They certainly are. Whatever confrontation lay ahead, Catherine resolved that she would not be merely a spectator. She had not spent 18 years searching for her son only to stand aside while others determined his fate. This time she would fight alongside him, alongside Elijah, the man who had both taken her child and saved his life. The storm was breaking, the paths clearing. Soon they would face Malcolm Harrison and whatever dark purpose had driven him to pursue them across 18 years and thousands of miles. But they would face him together. This strange family forged in loss and deception, now bound by a truth more powerful than any lie: love, in all its complicated, resilient forms. The morning the North Pass finally cleared dawned bright and cold, the sun glinting off snow-covered peaks with diamond brilliance. Fort Willow stirred to life after days of enforced isolation, traders and trappers eager to resume their business, to reconnect with the wider world beyond their small outpost. In Mrs. Carson's cabin, preparations of a different sort were underway. Thomas checked the priming on his rifle while Elijah packed supplies into saddlebag, enough for several days' journey, but light enough for speed if it came to that. Catherine sat at the table, writing rapidly on sheets of paper Miller had provided from the trading post. "You're sure about this?" Elijah asked, watching her document the details they had gathered over the past days. Catherine nodded without looking up. Sheriff Holt confirmed that Harrison has connections to the territorial judge. "If something happens to us, these records need to reach federal authorities, not local ones." Thomas approached, peering over her shoulder at the neat script flowing across the page. "Miller's cousin in Denver will make sure it gets to the right people." "He's given his word," Catherine confirmed, "and Mrs. Carson has agreed to send the package if we don't return within a week." The widow herself entered from the kitchen, her expression somber. "I've said it before, and I'll say it again. You're all fools for riding straight toward trouble instead of away from it." Despite her words, she pressed a small parcel of food into Catherine's hands. "But brave fools, at least." Thomas smiled at the older woman. "We'll be back before you know it, Mrs. Carson." "See that you are," she huffed, though her eyes betrayed her concern. "I've grown accustomed to the company." Within the hour, they were mounted and ready to depart. Thomas on his chestnut gelding, Elijah on his sturdy mountain pony, and Catherine on a mare borrowed from Miller. Fort Willow's residents had gathered to see them off, curious about the unusual trio and their urgent departure so soon after the pass had cleared. Sheriff Holt approached as they prepared to ride out. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "Harrison's men will be watching the main trail into Broken Pine, the old mining path. I marked on your map will bring you in from the east. Less chance of being spotted." Elijah nodded his thanks. "We'll be careful." As they rode away from the settlement, following the freshly cleared trail that would eventually branch toward Broken Pine, Thomas found himself between Catherine and Elijah, physical manifestation of the position he now occupied between the mother, who had lost him, and the father who had raised him. "Are you nervous?" Catherine asked, guiding her mare closer to his mount. Thomas considered the question. "Not nervous exactly, more resolve. Like whatever happens today has been waiting to happen for 18 years. Fate's a tricky thing to believe in," Elijah commented from his other side. "Makes a man careless thinking everything's predetermined." "Not fate," Thomas clarified. "Choice. Every choice made 18 years ago has led to this moment. Your choice to take me, Catherine's choice to search for me, Harrison's choice to pursue a debt across nearly 2 decades. He looked between them. "And now our choice to face it together." They rode in companionable silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts. The trail gradually narrowed as they left the main path, following Sheriff Holt's directions toward the disused mining route. The terrain grew steeper, the path less distinct, but Elijah navigated with the confidence of a man who had spent his life reading wilderness signs. By mid-afternoon, they crested a ridge that offered their first view of Broken Pine, a town significantly larger than Fort Willow. Nestled in a valley with a swift-running river cutting through its center, smoke rose from chimneys, and even from this distance, they could see the bustle of activity in the streets. "There," Elijah said, pointing to a large building near the riverfront. "That'll be Harrison's place, based on Miller's description. Looks like a hotel, but it'll house his gambling operation too." Catherine studied the town through narrowed eyes. "We should wait until dark to approach. Less chance of being recognized." "Agreed," Elijah said. "We'll make camp here and move in after nightfall." As Thomas dismounted to help set up their small camp, he found himself watching Catherine and Elijah, how they moved around each other with a cautious respect that hadn't existed days before. They had spent hours together planning this confrontation, setting aside their complex history for Thomas's sake. He found himself oddly grateful for the threat that had forced this cooperation, this tentative bridge between the two people who, each in their own way, had shaped his existence. Night fell swiftly in the mountain, stars emerging in a black velvet sky undiminished by the distant lights of Broken Pine. They left their horses secured at their campsite and made their way down to the town on foot, approaching from the east as planned. The streets were quieter now, though light and music spilled from several establishments, including Harrison's Riverfront Hotel. "Remember," Thomas said as they paused in the shadows near their destination, "we're here to negotiate, not fight. We have the evidence Sheriff Holt provided. Miller's testimony about Harrison's illegal shipments through the territory, and the names of officials on his payroll, and if negotiation fails?" Catherine asked, her voice steady despite her obvious tension. Thomas exchanged a glance with Elijah. "Then we have contingencies." They entered Harrison's establishment through the main doors, drawing curious glances from patrons but no immediate challenge. The interior was surprisingly elegant for a frontier town. Polished wood, brass fixtures, a long bar running the length of one wall. At the far end, a staircase led to the upper floors, guarded by 2 men whose formal attire didn't quite disguise their watchful posture. Thomas approached the bar, Catherine and Elijah flanking him. "We're here to see Malcolm Harrison," he stated simply. The barkeeper, a heavy-set man man with calculating eyes looked them over carefully. "Don't believe Mr. Harrison is expecting visitors this evening. Tell him Blackwood is here," Elijah said, his voice carrying just far enough to turn heads at nearby table. "And the boy from St. Louis." The effect was immediate. The barkeeper's eyes widened, and without another word, he signaled to one of the guards at the staircase. The man disappeared upstairs, returning moments later with a nod. "Mr. Harrison will see you," the barkeeper said, his tone notably more respectful. "Top floor, private quarters." As they climbed the stairs, Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. Whatever happened in the next hour would determine the course of the rest of his life, whether he would remain bound to the shadows of the past or finally be free to chart his own future. Malcolm Harrison's private quarters occupied the entire top floor of the building, a suite of rooms that would not have looked out of place in a fine St. Louis residence. The man himself stood by a window overlooking the river, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Court as they entered, escorted by 2 armed guards who took positions by the door. He was younger than Thomas had expected, perhaps 40, with sharp features and the kind of polished appearance that seemed at odds with frontier life. His eyes, however, held a coldness that matched everything Thomas had heard about him. "Elijah Blackwood," Harrison said, his voice cultured but hard. 18 years is a long time to track a thief. "I stole nothing that belonged to you," Elijah replied evenly. Harrison's gaze shifted to Thomas, studying him with unsettling intensity. "Must be the boy." "Thomas, is it? You look like your father." Same weak chin. Thomas felt Catherine stiffen beside him, but kept his own expression neutral. "I believe you've been looking for me, Mr. Harrison. I'd like to know why." Harrison smiled without warmth. "Direct. I appreciate that." He gestured toward chairs arranged near a fireplace. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." As they settled into the offered seats, Harrison remained standing, a subtle assertion of dominance. "Your father made a bargain with my father, Mr. Thornhill. A debt was incurred. Payment arranged, then ... stolen away in the night. I was an infant," Thomas said calmly. "Whatever arrangement was made, I had no part in, yet here you are, the very embodiment of that broken contract." Harrison's gaze shifted to Catherine, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Mrs. Thornhill, you survived, I see. My men believed you'd lost your mind, been institutionalized." "I found my way out," Catherine replied, her voice steady, "and eventually I found my son." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "A touching reunion, yet it changes nothing. A debt remains unpaid." "After 18 years?" Thomas challenged. "What possible value could that debt have now?" "Principal," Harrison said simply. "My father built his reputation on the understanding that no one escapes a debt to the Harrison family. No one." His expression hardened. "When he died, I inherited not only his business but his obligations, both those owed to him and those he owed to others." "We're not here to run," Thomas said. "We're here to settle this once and for all." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose to do that?" "You have nothing I want, Mr. Thornhill. This was never about money." "No," Thomas agreed. "It was about power, about making an example. But times have changed, Mr. Harrison." He reached inside his coat and withdrew the documents Catherine had prepared. "We know about your operations throughout the territory. The bribes, the smuggling, the officials on your payroll. If anything happens to any of us, this information goes to federal authorities." Harrison's expression remained impassive, but Thomas noted the slight tightening of his grip on his glass. "Allegations without proof. Hardly concerning." Sheriff Holt provided proof, Elijah interjected. "Records, dates, names. Enough to warrant a federal investigation at minimum." A flash of genuine concern crossed Harrison's face before he controlled it. "A standoff, then? Is that what you're proposing?" And then Thomas corrected. "A recognition that whatever claim you believed you had on me died with your father. I'm offering you a clean break. We go our separate ways. Your operations continue undisturbed, and the past remains buried." Harrison studied him for a long moment, then turned to look out the window again. "You know, my father spoke of you often over the years. The boy who got away. The debt unpaid." He sighed, seemingly genuinely reflective. "He was obsessed with it in a way. I sometimes wondered if it hastened his death." He turned back to them, his decision evident in his eyes before he spoke. "Very well, Mr. Thornhill, your terms are acceptable. The debt is canceled." He raised his glass in a mocking toast. 2 new beginnings. Thomas didn't relax, suspecting the capitulation had come too easily. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Harrison confirmed with a thin smile. "The world has changed, as you said. My interests have evolved beyond my father's petty vendettas." He set down his glass. "Besides, dead men can't pay debts, and I suspect attempting to collect from you would prove costly in ways I'm not prepared to justify to my investors." Thomas stood, signaling Catherine and Elijah to do the same. "Then we have an understanding." As they moved toward the door, Harrison called after them, "Mr. Thornhill." Thomas paused, turning back. "You're more like your father than you know, calculating enough to survive. Let's hope you're luckier than he was." Outside in the cold night air, none of them spoke until they were well away from Harrison's establishment, back in the shadows of Broken Pine's eastern edge. "He gave in to Italy," Elijah said, voicing what they all felt. "Yes," Thomas agreed, "but he's practical. The risk outweighs whatever satisfaction he'd get from revenge." "We should leave tonight," Catherine suggested. "Put as much distance between us and Broken Pine as possible." They retrieved their horses and rode through the night, following the mining trail back toward the ridge where they had first viewed the town. As dawn broke over the mountains, they paused to rest the animals and themselves, the tension of the confrontation finally beginning to ease. "What now?" Thomas asked, looking between Catherine and Elijah. "Where do we go from here?" They had discussed practical matters. Harrison's safety, escaped, but not what would come after. It's not where they would live. How they would proceed as this newly formed, unconventional family. Catherine smiled, exhaustion and relief mingling in her expression. Home, I suppose, wherever that may be for us now. The cabin at Bear Creek, Elijah suggested, surprising them both. It's remote, defensible, room enough for ... single quotes. He hesitated. For all of us, if that's what you want, Thomas. Thomas looked between them. The mother who had never stopped searching for him and the father who had never stopped protecting him. Two people who had begun as adversaries but now shared a common bond in him. Yes, he said simply, that's what I want. All of us together. As the sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in gold and rose, they mounted their horses and turned toward Fort Willow, the first step on a journey that would take them home, wherever that might be, not as Blackwoods or Thornhills, but as a family forged through loss and found again through persistence, courage, and the enduring power of love that transcended blood and time alike. The medallion around Thomas's neck caught the morning light, its tarnished surface gleaming with new possibility. Whatever name he chose to bear, whatever path he chose to follow, he would do so, knowing both where he had come from and who had brought him here, the elegant lady who had never stopped searching and the lonely trapper who had raised him as his own.